Prologue. The archive remembers what nothing else does. Liaison archivist Sura Embeth had spent 11 years cataloging the dead. Not literally, the Virith did not deal in corpses. That was a matter for physicians and grief counselors and the specific rituals each Concord species kept for their own departed. What Sura cataloged was the record of the dead. Incident files, distress logs, survivor testimonies. The long, cold paperwork trail that a tragedy left behind once the tragedy itself was over. It was not glamorous work. It was, her people believed, sacred work. A Virith proverb she had been raised on said that a person died twice. Once when their body stopped and a second, final time when the last record of them was lost. Sura's entire career had been built on making sure that second death came as late as possible, if it came at all. Which was why, when the resource survey report from Colony Persephone Deep crossed her desk at Concord Archive Station Vel, she noticed something that a less obsessive reader would have skimmed past in half a second. The report was routine. Persephone Deep was a mining colony on the planet Cassandra, 306 residents, extracting a rare crystalline mineral the Geological Survey had designated hollow crystal for its unusual property of refracting almost no light at all, appearing in sufficient concentration, less like a solid object and more like a precisely shaped absence. The colony had been operating for 14 months without incident. The survey report was the 9th in a routine quarterly series. It was also, Sura noticed, exactly 406 words shorter than the 8th report, despite covering the same reporting period, the same instrumentation, the same standard categories. She pulled the 8th report side by side with the 9th and began, with the specific patience of someone who had built a career on noticing what other people didn't, comparing them line by line. 3 named personnel from the 8th report did not appear anywhere in the 9th. Not as departed, not as transferred, not as deceased. They simply were not there, no mention, no gap, no acknowledgement that a gap existed at all. As if the report's author had never known them. Sura pulled the colony's personnel roster. All 3 names were listed as active crew, currently on site, no departure logged. She pulled communications logs. All 3 names appeared in message headers dated within the last 6 weeks. Routine correspondence, shift reports, 1 birthday message from a sibling on a Concord relay world, warm and ordinary and utterly unremarkable. And then, dated 11 days ago, the correspondence for all 3 simply stopped. Not with a farewell. Not with any final message at all. The thread simply ended mid-conversation, as though the person on the other end had put down whatever they were doing and never picked it back up, and nobody who remained had thought to ask why, because Sura was beginning to understand with a slow and specific horror that a Virith archivist felt more sharply than most species might have. Nobody who remained seemed to remember there was anything to ask about. She requested a live audio channel with Colony Director Amara Solis. It took 6 hours to get through. Cassandra's relay infrastructure was aging and the colony was, by its own account, extremely busy. Director Solis, I'm reviewing your 9th quarterly survey. I have some questions about personnel discrepancies. Solis's voice came through slightly delayed, tired in the specific way of someone managing a remote posting with insufficient sleep. Go ahead. Chief Surveyor Tomas Riel. Engineering Technician Davi Okonkwo-Lund. Environmental Officer Priya Chin. Sura read the names slowly, watching the audio waveform on her display for any flicker of recognition. Can you confirm their current status and location? A long pause, long enough that Sura checked the connection was still active. I'm sorry, Solis said finally. Those names aren't familiar. Are you sure you have the right colony roster? We're a small operation liaison. I know every name on this crew personally. Sura looked at the birthday message on her secondary display. Warm, specific, full of inside jokes about a childhood pet. Sent to Davi Okonkwo-Lund 4 months ago by someone who, according to Solis's own communications, had never met them. Director, Sura said carefully, I would like you to check your personnel roster right now, while I'm on the line with you, and tell me the total headcount. Another pause, the sound of a console being accessed. 303, Solis said. Your last quarterly report listed 306. That, Solis stopped. Sura heard, faintly, the sound of the director scrolling through a document, searching for something that the report itself no longer seemed to contain evidence of. That must be a data entry error on our end. I'll have someone look into it. Surah Embeth had spent 11 years learning to recognize the particular texture of a person telling the truth as they understood it, and being wrong about what that truth was. Solis was not lying. Solis genuinely did not remember 3 people who had, by every external record still in existence outside the colony itself, been alive and present 14 months into a routine mining assignment 11 days ago. She thanked the director, ended the call, and sat very still in her archive office for a long moment, feeling something she did not have adequate professional language for. Then she opened a priority flag, attached every document she had, the 2 survey reports, the communications logs, the birthday message, a transcript of her own call with Solis, and sent it not through the standard Concord threat assessment queue, which she had learned over the years moved at a pace built for problems that could afford to wait, but directly, personally, to a contact she had maintained ever since a training exchange 9 years prior with a joint Concord Coalition research initiative. A human contact. Attached, last she'd heard, to something called the Deep Records Division, a small, quiet unit of the coalition of Earth and allied worlds that, as far as Surah's clearance allowed her to understand, existed for exactly one purpose: making sure that when something erased people from history, humanity made very certain history remembered them anyway. The reply came back in 9 minutes. Received. We need to talk. Are you available for a secure call in the next hour? Surah was. She did not yet know that the woman on the other end of that call, Fleet Commander Elena Marsh, had spent the last 9 months since the loss of the UNS Marlow's Reach preparing, in exhaustive and obsessive detail, for the exact possibility that something like Persephone Deep would happen again. She was about to find out that humanity had built an entire ship, an entire philosophy, around the specific, furious refusal to let anyone be forgotten. The ship that was already grieving the call connected on video, which surprised Surah. Most Concord human diplomatic exchanges she'd conducted defaulted to audio only, a courtesy extended to species whose visual communication norms varied widely enough that video calls occasionally caused more confusion than they resolved. Elena Marsh had apparently decided that courtesy did not apply here. She was a compact woman with close-cropped gray-streaked hair and the kind of stillness in her face that Surah, after 9 years of cross-species diplomatic training, had learned to associate specifically with humans who had lost something and built an entire career around making sure it never happened to anyone else the same way. Liaison Embeth, Marsh said. Thank you for reaching out directly. I've read your file. I'd like to show you something, and I want you to understand it's classified 2 levels above what your current clearance permits. And I'm showing it to you anyway because I think you're the only person on the Concord side who's going to understand what you're looking at fast enough to matter. I appreciate the trust, Commander. Show me. Marsh pulled up a file. A ship's manifest, dated 9 months earlier. UNS Marlow's Reach, a survey corvette, crew of 22, dispatched to catalog a mineral deposit at a remote research outpost called Calder's Rest. 22 names, Marsh said. I want you to read them. Surah read them. Ordinary names, ordinary ranks, the unremarkable roster of a routine scientific mission. Now look at the current Coalition personnel database, Marsh said, and pulled up a second file. Search any of those names. Surah searched. 16 of the 22 returned no results at all. Not marked deceased. Not marked missing. Simply absent, as though the database itself had never contained them, the way Persephone Deep's roster had never contained 3 names that should have been there. 16 people, Marsh said, who were on that ship when it launched, confirmed by 3 independent manifests, video logs, biometric boarding records, and who, for months after the mission, no longer appeared anywhere in any system that wasn't specifically isolated and air-gapped before the mission began. Their families don't remember having a second child. Their colleagues don't remember working with them. In one case, Liaison, a woman's own medical record, her own, from a hospital that treated her for a broken arm when she was 9 years old, 40 years before any of this, that record still exists. But the record of her enlistment, filed 11 months ago, is gone. Not deleted. Gone the way something is gone when it never happened. Surah's secondary eyelids had compressed so tightly they ached. This is retrocausal. Whatever this is, it is not merely destroying people. It is unmaking the fact of their existence, backward through time, wherever that existence was recorded. That's our working theory too, Marsh said. We call it the undertow. Not officially. Officially it's Coalition Threat Signature 7, Class 1 Hostile, Threat Rating Pending, Same bureaucratic nonsense every mystery gets before somebody with the authority to name things properly gets around to it. Unofficially, every person who worked the Marlowe's Reach recovery calls it the undertow, because that's what it does. It pulls you under, and it pulls the evidence you were ever swimming under with you. How did 6 of your 22 survive being unmade? Marsh's jaw tightened. The first genuinely human gesture of visible feeling Sura had seen from her. Because one of them was smart enough, fast enough, and scared enough in the 11 minutes she had between the first personnel report vanishing and the moment she made it off that outpost, to physically transmit. Not digitally file, physically broadcast on an open radio band, no encryption, no digital record that could be reached back and erased. A full verbal roster of every name on that mission, plus biometric confirmations to a relay station 40 light minutes away that had absolutely no other connection to Calder's Rest at all. Isolated. Untouched. Outside whatever radius this thing's retrocausal effect could reach. And the 16 it took? We don't know if took is even the right word, Marsh said quietly. We don't know if they're dead. We don't know if erasing the record of someone's existence is the same thing as erasing the someone. That's the question that's kept me up more nights than I want to admit to a Concord official I've known for 11 minutes. Liaison, so I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if the 16 people my ship lost are gone, or if they're somewhere, still real, still themselves, with absolutely nothing and no one left in the universe that remembers them well enough to look. Sura sat with that for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "That is the worst thing I have heard a colleague say to me in 11 years of this work." "Yeah," Marsh said. "It's the reason the Marlowe's Reach recovery report went straight to Coalition High Command with a budget request attached. And the reason that budget request got approved in 6 days flat, which for a military appropriations committee is basically a religious miracle. We built a ship, Liaison. We built it specifically to go back into a Persephone Deep situation with everything we learned costing us 16 people the first time. It's called the Undying Ledger, and as of 40 minutes ago, on my authority, it's burning toward Cassandra at maximum safe transit. You dispatched it before contacting me. I dispatched it the moment your flag came through Deep Records, because I've read this exact pattern before and I know what the next 24 hours look like if nobody moves fast. I'm contacting you now because I need something from you that I can't get from anyone else, and I need it before we arrive." "What do you need, Commander?" "I need every name," Marsh said. "On Persephone Deep's current roster, cross-referenced against every archive, backup, and secondary record your people keep. The ones that aren't stored locally on Cassandra, the ones an unmaking effect centered on that colony can't reach back and touch. I need a complete, independently verified manifest of 306 human lives, built somewhere the undertow has never been, before it gets the chance to convince anyone, including us, that some of them never existed at all." Sura Embeth had spent 11 years building the largest, most meticulous cross-referenced archive of individual Concord lives in the sector, precisely because her people believed a person's second death, the death of memory, was the one death that could, with sufficient diligence, be prevented. "Commander Marsh," she said, "you have found, I believe, the single Concord official in this quadrant most professionally and personally prepared to give you exactly that. Send me your secure channel. I will have a verified manifest to you within the hour, and I request, formally, permission to accompany it aboard your vessel as observer." Something in Marsh's carefully controlled face shifted. Not quite a smile, but close to it. The specific expression of a person recognizing, unexpectedly, a colleague who understood the stakes without needing them explained twice. "Permission granted, Liaison. Welcome to the Undying Ledger. I hope you like the company. We're a little obsessive about not losing people." "Commander," Sura said. "So am I, too." 303, and counting down the Undying Ledger was not, Sura discovered upon boarding 6 hours later, a warship in any conventional sense she'd been briefed to expect. It carried weapons, considerable ones, she would learn, more than sufficient to qualify it for the same Goliath-class designation the Coalition reserved for its heaviest combat vessels. But the majority of the ship's internal volume, she realized walking its corridors under the escort of a young ensign named Priyanka Osei, was given over to something else entirely. Server racks. Rows and rows of them, running the length of 3 separate decks, each one humming with the specific dense heat of active, continuous, redundant data processing. "What is all this?" Sura asked. "Anchor arrays," Osei said. Every crew member aboard gets a full biometric, genetic, and personal record backup, continuously updated, mirrored across 9 physically separate storage cores, 3 of which are hardened, shielded, and kept in a completely isolated compartment with its own independent power supply specifically so that nothing, and I mean nothing, ma'am, that's not hyperbole, that's the literal design spec, can reach all 9 copies at once from outside the ship. Osei's voice carried the specific pride of someone reciting something she'd helped build. Chief Okafor calls it, making sure we're too stubborn to forget. And the colonists? Persephone Deep's 306? 303 as of the last data pull, ma'am, Osei said, and something in her voice went carefully flat in a way Sura was beginning to recognize as the specific human discipline of not letting a bad number slow you down. Your manifest's already been ingested and cross-mirrored into all 9 cores. If this thing tries what it did at Calder's Rest, it's not just erasing 306 names off one colony database anymore. It's got to reach into 9 independently shielded storage cores aboard a moving warship it's never encountered before, and take every copy at once, or it doesn't get any of them. Has that ever been tested? Osei's pause was answer enough. No, ma'am. Nobody's ever gotten close enough to something like this and lived to test it. That's kind of the whole mission, honestly. Finding out. The bridge, when Sura reached it, held the same dense quiet focus she was coming to associate with human military vessels under pressure. Not loud, not chaotic, but every station occupied, every screen doing something, and at the center of it, Fleet Commander Elena Marsh, standing at the main display with her arms folded, studying a slowly resolving sensor picture of Cassandra with an expression Sura had last seen on the face of a grieving parent at a memorial archive dedication. Focused, controlled, and entirely unwilling to let the grief get in front of the work still left to do. Liaison, Marsh said without turning. Good timing. First long-range sensor sweeps coming in now. The display resolved slowly, Cassandra, a rust-colored world with thin cloud cover, Persephone Deep visible as a cluster of habitat domes and mining infrastructure on its northern continent. From this distance it looked, Sura thought, entirely ordinary. Lights on. Structures intact. Chief Okafor, Marsh said. Talk to me. A woman at the engineering station, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, with the specific comm precision Sura had come to associate, across 2 separate encounters now with human Deathworlder crews, as the signature of an engineer who had personally built every system she was currently trusting her life to, pulled up a secondary overlay. Passive sweep only, like you ordered, Commander. Colonies registering full population, 303 heat signatures, matches the last verified count. Power grids nominal. Comms are active, colonies broadcasting a standard operational status, nothing urgent, nothing flagged. That's wrong, Marsh said quietly. Ma'am, 303 is wrong. Sura's manifest says 306, verified independently, off-world, for separate sources. If the colony's own systems are reporting 303 and matching that number to the heat signatures we're reading, then whatever took the other 3, Okafor finished, slow and grim, took them cleanly enough that even the life support system doesn't know it's short 3 people. It's not just erasing records. It's erasing the expectation of those people. Nobody down there is going to report anyone missing, because nobody down there remembers there's anyone to miss. The bridge went quiet. Sound familiar? Marsh said, and it wasn't really a question. Exactly like Calder's Rest, said a man at the tactical station, tall, sharp-eyed, with a Marine sergeant's particular economy of movement even standing still. Sura had been introduced to him briefly on the way to the bridge. Sergeant Idris Kane, ground team lead, one of the 6 survivors of the Marlowe's Reach. Except last time, Kane continued, we didn't have 300 people's worth of independently verified names in a shielded archive before we got there. Last time we found out the hard way, 1 report at a time, that people were missing, and by the time we noticed the pattern, we'd already lost most of them. Not this time, Marsh said. This time we walk in already knowing exactly how many people are supposed to be alive down there, and we do not leave until every single number matches. Okafor, time to orbit? 40 minutes at current burn. Give me 30, and get the anchor teams briefed, full manifest cross-check protocol, live biometric capture on every colonist we make contact with the moment we make contact. I want every single person down there re-anchored into our arrays before this thing gets a chance to reach for anyone else. Copy that, Commander. 30 minutes. Sura, standing at the edge of the bridge in the observer's position Marsh's crew, had efficiently and without comment made space for her in, found herself thinking of a Virith teaching she had not considered seriously since her earliest archival training. A name spoken aloud by someone who remembers you is a small resurrection. She had always understood it as a metaphor. Watching Elena Marsh's crew move with the specific, disciplined urgency of people who had personally lost 16 names to an unmaking 9 months earlier and had built an entire warship in response, Sura began to suspect it might, on Cassandra, turn out to be something closer to literal. 3. What was left of Calder's Rest Sergeant Idris Kane had told the story of Calder's Rest exactly 4 times in 9 months. Once to the official inquiry, once to a coalition grief counselor he'd stopped seeing after 3 sessions because talking about it in a room with soft chairs made it feel smaller than it was, once to Elena Marsh personally, late one night in the Undying Ledger's half-finished server deck while the ship was still being built around them, and once now to Sura Embeth because she asked him directly, and because he had decided somewhere in the last 22 days that she was the kind of person who needed to hear it exactly as it happened rather than as a summarized incident file. They sat together in the Undying Ledger's mess hall, 3 days after the review board's finding, the ship holding position at a routine waypoint while Marsh finalized the ship's next assignment. Kane turned a ration cup slowly between his hands, not drinking from it, the way Sura had noticed humans sometimes did when they needed their hands occupied by something that wasn't the thing they were actually doing. Calder's Rest wasn't a colony, he said. Not like Persephone Deep. It was a research outpost, 22 people, mostly geologists and a couple of xenoarchaeologists, cataloging a mineral deposit some survey drone had flagged 18 months earlier. Nothing about the initial reports suggested danger. It was, by every measure anybody had at the time, the single most boring assignment in the sector. That's actually part of why it happened the way it did. Nobody was braced for anything, including me. You were part of the original mission, Sura said. Not the recovery. I was ground security detail. Standard posting, you send a small security team to any coalition research outpost operating outside charted territory, mostly for micrometeor strikes and equipment malfunctions, not because anybody expects a fight. I'd been on that rock for 6 weeks before it happened. Long enough to know everyone's name. Long enough that some of them had stopped being names on a roster and started being people I ate breakfast with. He set the cup down. That matters, for what I'm about to tell you. It matters that I knew them. I understand. The first sign was the same as Cassandra, a silence report from a 2-person survey team working the edge of the deposit. They radioed in that their equipment had gone quiet, no ambient pickup at all, like someone had switched off the whole planet's atmosphere around them. We didn't have a model for it yet. Nobody had ever reported anything like it before. Our mission lead, Dr. Osei Boateng, brilliant man, genuinely kind, the kind of scientist who remembered everyone's birthday, chalked it up to equipment failure and sent a technician out to check the gear. Kane's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The technician's name was Pharaoh. She went out to check a sound-dampening glitch on a piece of survey equipment. That's the whole story of how it started. Nobody sounded an alarm because nobody had a reason to think there was an alarm to sound. When did you realize something was wrong? 40 minutes later, when Pharaoh didn't check back in on schedule and the survey team that had reported the original glitch also stopped responding. I led a 4-person team out to check on both groups. We found the 2-person survey team first, inside a radius that, looking back, was already at least 60 meters across, though nobody'd mapped a boundary yet because nobody knew there was a boundary to map. He paused. They were fine, confused, a little disoriented, complaining that their radios weren't working. We walked them back out. It wasn't until we got them clear of the zone and did a head count against the mission roster that we realized there'd been a 3rd person on that survey team originally, and none of us, not me, not the 2 survivors, not the mission log, could remember his name or that he'd ever been assigned to it at all. The equipment manifest still listed his gear as checked out. Nobody remembered him carrying it. Sura felt something cold settle in her chest, the specific horror of hearing secondhand, a thing she had only understood in the abstract from Marsh's account weeks earlier. That was the first one, Kane said quietly. We didn't know it yet, but that was the first one. We went looking for Pharaoh next. That's when the boundary found us instead of the other way around. He was quiet for a long moment before continuing. It had grown. Faster than what we saw on Cassandra because we didn't have a resonance model yet, we didn't know what we were looking at, we were still running standard search and recovery protocol into a zone that had already tripled in size in under an hour. I lost radio contact with 2 of my own security team 11 minutes after we crossed the original boundary line. I found one of them 15 minutes after that. Corporal Denny Achebe, good Marine, steady hands. Standing in the middle of the survey camp with that same doubled voice you heard out of Bakri. Except Denny'd been in there longer. There wasn't much Denny left to pull out by the time I found him. What did you do? I got him out anyway. Physically dragged him past the line, same as I did with Bakri. He came out. Kane stopped, and for the first time in the conversation his composure genuinely cracked. Just slightly. Just enough that Sura understood she was hearing something he had never fully said aloud before, not even to Marsh. He came out breathing. His heart was beating. But whatever makes a person recognizably themselves, whatever it is that makes Denny Achebe mean something specific instead of just meaning a living human body, that was gone. He didn't know his own name. He didn't know mine, and I'd served next to him for 3 years. The medics on Titan still don't know if that comes back. 9 months later, it hasn't. That is the survivor Commander Marsh mentioned, Sura said softly. The one in long-term care. Yeah. Kane's voice was rough. That's Denny. I got him out of the zone. I did not get him out. There's a difference, and I've spent 9 months trying to figure out if I did the right thing anyway, because at least his body's alive, at least there's something to visit, at least his family has a person to sit with even if that person doesn't remember being their son. I don't know if that's mercy or just a longer, slower kind of losing him. I genuinely don't know. Sura let the silence hold for a moment. The way her training had taught her silences sometimes needed to be held rather than filled. How many did the recovery team ultimately save? She asked, though she already knew the number from Marsh's account. 6 total out of 22. Denny was one of the 6, and I don't know if that number's supposed to make me feel better or worse most days. Kane looked up at her directly. 16 people, liaison. Dr. Boateng, Pharaoh. 14 others whose names I made myself memorize, everyone, because I decided somewhere in the recovery that if the universe was going to take the record of them, it wasn't going to take mine, even if mine wasn't official enough to matter to anybody but me. I still say all 16 names out loud, once a week, alone in my quarters. Marsh knows I do it. She's never asked me to stop, and she's never asked to join me either. I think she's got her own version of the same ritual, and I think it's private enough between us both that neither of us has ever pushed to find out what the other one's looks like. And the resonance pulse, the technique the Undying Ledger used at Cassandra. Where did that theory originate? Marsh, Kane said, and something in his voice shifted warmer. The specific respect of a man who had watched someone turn grief into a working system rather than letting it turn them into wreckage. She wasn't even supposed to be on the recovery team. She was Coalition Intelligence Liaison at the time, assigned to review the incident after the fact, not command the response. But she read every scrap of data we'd managed to pull off Calder's Rest before the site went fully dark, and she noticed the same thing Okafor noticed on Cassandra. The collapse correlated exactly with a mineral deposit spectral signature. She spent the next 7 months on her own time mostly building a theoretical model for disrupting that correlation, and when Coalition High Command finally greenlit the Undying Ledger project, she made sure the resonance array was the very first system installed, before the weapons, before the shielding, before anything else. Everybody on this ship who was there for Calder's Rest signed on to the Undying Ledger specifically because Marsh was the one building it. We didn't want to serve under anybody else. We wanted to serve under the person who'd spent 7 months turning 16 names into a plan that might make sure it never happened to 16 more. Did it work this time? 20 for 23 if you count the 3 that came back, Kane said. That's not a number I ever thought I'd get to say out loud. 9 months ago I said 16 for 22, and that number's the reason I get up every morning and check my gear 4 times before a mission instead of once. I don't know if today's number means the ghosts finally starting to lose to us, or if it just means we got lucky on top of being prepared. Marsh says both things can be true at once. I've decided to believe her because the alternative is deciding none of it means anything, and I don't have room left in me for that particular belief. Sura thought of a Virith teaching she had recited to Okafor weeks earlier, a person dies twice, and understood, sitting across from a man who said 16 names aloud alone in his quarters once a week specifically so the universe couldn't finish the job of forgetting them, that the coalition had, in its own idiosyncratic and grief-forged way, arrived at something remarkably close to the same conviction her own people had spent millennia building an entire archival tradition around. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me exactly as it happened, and not as a summary." "You asked," Kane said simply. "Most people don't. I think that's part of why I said yes." He picked the ration cup back up, finally drank from it, and something in his shoulders eased, fractionally, the specific and hard-won relief of a burden shared rather than lightened. "Come on. Marsh wants a full debrief before we head out again, and Okafor's been dying to show somebody her upgraded anchor array specs since Cassandra. Might as well be you. She likes an audience who actually understands what she's showing them." For what the convoy didn't understand, the Concord Relief Convoy, 3 vessels under the command of a Pharanic logistics officer named Dul Varesh, dispatched from the nearest Concord waypoint the moment Sura's flag reached formal channels, was, per standard protocol, already 31 minutes from Cassandra by the time the Undying Ledger dropped out of transit. Varesh's opening transmission was courteous, procedurally correct, and entirely uninformed about the specific nature of what his convoy was about to fly into. "Coalition vessel Undying Ledger, this is Convoy Commander Varesh. We've received your threat advisory and appreciate the concern, but our mandate is a standard resource audit visit, not an emergency response. Colony status reports show nominal operations. We intend to proceed with our scheduled docking. Please confirm you'll maintain a non-interference posture." Marsh's reply was immediate and entirely without diplomatic softening. "Commander Varesh, I need you to hold your convoy at minimum 40,000 kilometers until further notice. What you're calling a resource audit is walking into an active retrocausal erasure event that has already claimed at least 3 colonists without the colony itself being aware it's happened. I've got a verified manifest showing your nominal operations report is 3 people short of the truth, and I need you to trust me on this without a formal Concord threat classification behind it, because I do not have time to wait for one before whatever's down there decides your convoy looks like more of what it wants." There was a pause long enough that Sura, monitoring the channel, understood Varesh was consulting someone off-comm, a superior, a protocol officer, some procedural authority that Concord logistics vessels were bound to defer to before deviating from a scheduled mandate. "Commander Marsh," Varesh said finally, "I understand your concern, and I have logged your advisory formally. However, I am required to note that an unverified threat claim from a coalition vessel, absent Concord classification, does not meet the threshold for deviation from an active resource mandate. We will proceed to minimum safe distance and hold position pending your assessment, but I cannot authorize a full withdrawal without—" "I'm not asking for a withdrawal," Marsh said. "I'm asking for 40,000 kilometers and 40 minutes. That's it. That's the entire ask." Another pause. "Understood. We will hold at range. Please keep this channel updated." Sura, listening, thought of Sura Embeth's own message to Belthurash on a different mission she had, in fact, never actually sent. This was her first field deployment of this kind, she reminded herself, and felt a strange doubling sensation, as though she were living through the shape of an inevitability rather than a single unrepeatable event. She wondered, distantly and only for a moment, whether this was simply what it felt like when a pattern the galaxy kept generating, comfortable species, built comfortable protocols, meeting an uncomfortable universe, repeated itself in a slightly different shape each time, and whether the humans, having met it more than once now, were the only ones who had stopped being surprised by the shape. "He held," Marsh said, lowering the comm. "That's more than I got out of the Serenox convoy commander at Calder's Rest. I'll take it." "You've done this before," Sura said. It was not quite a question. "Once," Marsh said. "Badly. We're trying very hard not to do it badly twice." The silence that arrives first, the Undying Ledger made orbit 26 minutes later, and the first full active sensor sweep of Persephone Deep confirmed what Sura had already begun, with a slow cold dread, to suspect. "Commander," Okafor said, "I'm reading an anomalous zone, southeast quadrant, near the crystal processing facility. Sound propagations drop to 0 across a growing radius. Not silenced, Commander, absent. My instruments aren't picking up ambient noise floor at all inside that boundary. Not low. Not muffled. Nothing. Like sound itself doesn't propagate there. Size of the zone? 40 meters radius as of this reading. Expanding slowly, but steadily. I'm cross-referencing against the Marlowe's Reach incident data now. A pause, and when Okafor spoke again, her voice had gone tight. Commander, this matches. Exactly matches the pre-collapse signature from Calder's Rest. The silence isn't a side effect. It's the warning. Sound's the first thing that goes because whatever this thing is, it's already started unmaking the space inside that radius, and propagating sound requires a medium that still fully, consistently exists from one instant to the next. The silence is what a hole in reality sounds like from the outside. How long between silence onset and full event at Calder's Rest? 40 minutes, Kane said, from the tactical station. His voice flat with the particular controlled grief of a man doing math he had done before, in worse circumstances with worse outcomes. 40 minutes from first silence report to full retrocausal collapse across the original impact zone. We had 4 survivors physically extract from inside the silence boundary in that window. 16 didn't make it out before the boundary closed. How long has this one been active? Marsh asked. Okafor checked the data. Based on radius and expansion rate matched against the Calder's Rest model, Commander, I estimate onset at approximately 11 minutes ago. The bridge went very still. 29 minutes, Marsh said. Before this does whatever it did to Calder's Rest, on a colony 3 times the size, with 300 people who have no idea anything's wrong. She was already moving. Ground team, full anchor protocol now. Kane, I want a live biometric capture on every colonist you make physical contact with the moment you reach them. I don't care if they're calm, confused, or actively arguing with you about it. I want their name, their face, their voice, and their heartbeat mirrored into all 9 cores before this thing gets a chance to decide they never existed. Okafor, I need you running continuous scan on that silence boundary's expansion rate, and I need real-time updates on how much time we've actually got, because 29 minutes is a model, not a promise. Copy, Commander. Sura. Marsh turned. I need you on comms, direct channel to Director Solis, right now, and I need you to convince her to start moving every single person she can reach toward the colony's central hall before that silence boundary finishes eating the southeast quadrant. She's not going to believe you. Convince her anyway. Sura Embeth, Virith archivist, who had spent 11 years believing that her most important professional skill was patience, discovered in the next 90 seconds that she also, when the situation demanded it, possessed something closer to the specific human urgency Naomi Reyes's records had described to her in an entirely separate briefing months before this posting. The willingness to act on incomplete information because complete information would arrive too late to matter. She opened the channel. Director Solis. This is Liaison Embeth. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to act before you finish deciding whether you believe me. 40 meters and closing Director Amara Solis was, Sura would later note in her official report, precisely the kind of colony administrator that made a genuine catastrophe survivable. Skeptical by professional habit, but capable of moving fast the moment the evidence outran her skepticism. Liaison, I don't have anyone reporting an emergency down here. What am I supposed to be evacuating from? A retrocausal erasure event that has already claimed 3 of your personnel without leaving behind any awareness that they existed, Sura said. Director, I do not have time to make this claim persuasive. I need you to trust the math instead. Your own quarterly report shows 306 colonists as of 6 weeks ago. Your current headcount is 303. Nobody has filed a departure. Nobody has filed a death. There is no record anywhere in your systems of what happened to the missing 3, because whatever is doing this does not simply kill people, Director. It removes the fact that they were ever here to be killed. There was a silence on the line long enough that Sura thought the channel had dropped. The Chen family, Solis said very quietly. I keep having a feeling like I'm supposed to remember no. There's no Chen family on this roster. I don't know why I said that. Priya Chen, environmental officer. She sent a message to her sibling 4 months ago about a childhood pet. I have it in front of me right now, Director. It is real. She was real. She is being erased from your memory in real time while we are speaking, and I need you to move your people before whatever is doing this finishes the job on the rest of the colony." So Lisa's breath caught audibly over the channel. Sura understood, with the specific horror of watching theory become observed fact, that she had just listened to a woman feel a person disappear from inside her own memory in real time. "Where?" so Lisa said, her voice tight and controlled in the way of someone holding on to function by main force. "Do I move them to?" "Your central hall. Away from the southeast quadrant. Away from the crystal processing facility. A coalition ground team is descending now. Move fast, Director. Move now." The ground team hit the surface 11 minutes later, and the corridor leading toward the southeast quadrant was, Sura thought, watching the feed from the observer station aboard the bridge, the most unsettling thing she had witnessed in 11 years of archival work. Not because it looked wrong, but because of exactly how little it looked wrong. Colonists moved through the corridors in ordinary, unhurried fashion, going about routine tasks, entirely unaware that anything had changed. A woman carried a tray of equipment past the junction leading toward the processing facility, humming faintly, and the sound, Sura noted with a cold lurch, simply stopped the moment she crossed an invisible line in the corridor, though she herself did not react at all, continuing on in what looked, from outside, like perfectly normal silence, oblivious that her own humming had been swallowed by something with no visible boundary at all. "Contact." Kane's voice came through, tight and controlled. "Ground team is at the silence threshold. Confirmed, sound cutoff is instantaneous and total. No transition, no fade. It's a hard line." "Anyone crossed it yet?" Marsh asked. "Negative, Commander. Standing off. Requesting guidance." "Okafor. Time remaining on the model?" 18 minutes, Commander, and that's if the expansion rate holds steady, which it hasn't. It's accelerating. I'm now estimating 14. Marsh's jaw tightened. "Kane, I need eyes past that boundary. What's happening inside the silence zone?" A pause. Then Kane's voice again, lower. "Commander, I've got a visual on personnel inside the boundary. They're just working. Standard shift activity. They don't seem aware anything's different." Another pause, longer. "Commander, I count 6 people visible from this position, inside the zone. My manifest crosscheck says there should be 9 assigned to this shift block." 3 already gone," Marsh said quietly. "And nobody in there knows it. What's my order, Commander?" Marsh was silent for exactly 1 second. Sura had learned, over the last several hours, that this was the precise and consistent length of the pause Elena Marsh permitted herself before every decision that mattered. "Cross the line," Marsh said. "Full anchor protocol, contact and capture. Every person you can physically reach, starting with whoever's closest to the deepest part of that zone and working outward. You are not there to evacuate calmly, Sergeant. You are there to grab as many people as you can get your hands on and get them past that boundary before it closes on them the way it closed on Calder's Rest. Go." "Copy, Commander. Going in." 7. Inside the line, Sergeant Idris Kane had crossed the boundary at Calder's Rest exactly once, 9 months earlier, and had spent every day since then rebuilding, in exhaustive physical and mental detail, every second of what he had found on the other side of it. Crossing into the Persephone Deep Silence Zone felt, he would tell the review board weeks later, wrong in a way his body understood before his mind caught up to it. Not painful, not disorienting in any way his training had a name for, but simply immediately quiet in a manner that had nothing to do with the absence of sound and everything to do with the specific, bone-deep animal certainty that something in this space had stopped agreeing to be entirely real. He moved fast, the way 7 months of drilling this exact scenario in simulation had built into muscle memory that didn't require conscious thought to execute. First target. A man crouched at a processing console, entirely absorbed in routine work, 3 meters past the boundary line. Kane's hand closed on the man's shoulder. "Coalition rescue. I need you to come with me right now." The man turned, startled, entirely lucid, entirely himself, and Kane's biometric capture rig activated the instant contact was made. A full-spectrum scan feeding directly into the Undying Ledger's 9 anchor cores, locking down a name, a face, a heartbeat, a genetic signature, a life, into 9 independently shielded storage systems before whatever was eating this space got the chance to decide it had never happened. "What's going on? What rescue?" the man said, bewildered. as Kane physically hauled him toward the boundary line. Explain on the way. Move. He got the man across the line. The silence broke around them the instant they crossed. Sound rushing back in. The man's own confused questions suddenly audible. And Kane felt something in his chest he refused, on principle, to examine too closely mid-mission. One anchored. He went back in. The next 11 minutes, which Kane would later describe in his after-action report with the specific flat understatement of a man who had learned that overstating trauma to a review board rarely made the review go faster, were the most physically demanding of his career. He crossed the line 7 times. He anchored and extracted 5 people. The 6th, a young technician named Bakri, barely into his 2nd year on the colony, was standing at the deepest point of the zone Kane had reached, close enough to the crystal processing core that the air itself seemed to carry a faint, wrong shimmer like heat distortion except cold. Coalition rescue, Kane said, closing the distance. Come with me. Bakri turned. And Kane, in the half-second before contact, saw something that stopped him cold for the first time in the entire operation. Bakri's face, when he turned, held an expression that was not confusion, was not surprise, was not any reaction appropriate to being suddenly addressed by an armed stranger in the middle of a routine shift. It was recognition. Bakri looked at Kane the way you look at someone you have been expecting. You're too late for the others, Bakri said, in a voice that carried, faintly underneath his own, something else. A second cadence, layered and slightly out of phase, the way 2 recordings of the same sentence played a fraction of a second apart might sound if you heard them simultaneously. It already has what it needed from them. It's still hungry, though. It's very patient. It's been very patient for a very long time. Bakri, look at me. I need you to come with me right now. I don't think, Bakri said, still in that layered, doubled voice, that Bakri is available to do that anymore. Kane's biometric rig, still capturing continuously, showed something on its display that made his blood run cold even through the discipline of 9 months of drilled protocol. Bakri's heartbeat, visible on the scanner, was not one signal. It was 2, overlapping, one recognizably human and one that registered on no biological baseline the rig's database contained at all. Anchor lock, Kane said into his calm, forcing his voice level. Commander, I need eyes on this. Something's using this man's voice, and I don't think it's just talking through him the way. He caught himself. This wasn't the cradle. This wasn't Corvain 9. He didn't have that comparison to reach for here, and something about not having it, about facing an entirely new shape of wrongness with no prior pattern to map it onto, made his hands, steady for 9 years of active service, shake very slightly for the first time that day. Kane, report. Marsh's voice, sharp and immediate. Commander, I've got contact. I don't think it's just a person in shock. Something's talking through him or with him, or, Commander, my biometric rig is reading 2 heartbeats off one body and the second one doesn't match anything in the database. A pause. Okafor? Commander, I'm seeing it on the anchor feed too. That's not a person under stress. That's a person who's already partway unmade and partway still there. I think, Commander, I think the erasure isn't instant. I think it's a process, and I think Bakri's caught somewhere in the middle of it. Can we anchor him anyway? I don't know, Okafor said, and for the first time in the entire operation, Sura heard the specific note of a person admitting the limits of what they'd built. The anchor protocol's built to lock down a stable identity signature. If he's mid-process, if part of what makes him him is already gone, I don't know what we'd be locking down. It might not be enough of him left to anchor. Kane, Marsh said, can you get him out? Kane looked at Bakri, at the young technician's face, still holding that expression of patient, doubled recognition, at the 2 heartbeats layered on his scanner display, at the seconds ticking down on Okafor's expansion model. I can try, Commander. Try. Kane reached out and closed his hand around Bakri's arm. The contact was immediate and violent in a way nothing in 9 months of preparation had readied him for, not physical pain, but a cold, spreading pressure that felt, he would tell the medic afterward, like being asked a question by something that didn't understand yet that the answer mattered to him. His own biometric rig spiked, briefly, with a flicker of the same double signal pattern he'd seen on Bakri's readout, and for 1/2 second that he would spend the rest of his career trying not to think about too closely, Sergeant Idris Kane felt something vast and patient and entirely without malice reach toward the fact that he existed, and consider, with total indifference, whether it was hungry enough to keep it. Then Okafor's voice, sharp and urgent through his calm. Kane anchors engaging. I'm getting a partial lock. Commander, it's fighting the capture. I need 3 more seconds. Get him out, Kane, now. Marsh's voice no longer level. Kane pulled. Bakri's body came with him, stumbling, unresisting, and the doubled voice that had been speaking through him cut off mid-syllable as Kane hauled them both bodily across the boundary line. Back into ordinary sound, ordinary light, ordinary reality. The two of them collapsing together onto the ground outside the silence zone as the world came rushing back in around them. Anchor complete, Okafor said, breathless with relief. Commander, I've got a full lock. He's anchored. All 9 cores confirm. Bakri lay on the ground, breathing hard, blinking up at a sky he had not, a moment ago, seemed to fully register was there. What? He said, in a voice that was entirely, singularly his own, no second cadence beneath it at all. Just happened to me? Kane, sitting beside him in the dirt, did not have an answer that felt adequate to give. He gave the only one he had. You came back, he said. That's what happened. You came back. 14 minutes, Commander, Okafor said, her voice tight. Expansions accelerating hard. I'm now reading 9 minutes to full zone collapse, and Kane's extraction just confirmed something we needed confirmed and really didn't want to know. This thing doesn't just erase you instantly when the boundary reaches you. There's a process, a window, which means there might be people still savable inside that zone right up until the last second, Marsh finished. And it means every second we spend confirming that is a second we don't have. Commander, I've got a bigger problem, Kane said. Back on his feet, Bakri handed off to a second Marine for immediate extraction to the shuttle. I count at least 40 more colonists inside the current boundary, based on shift rosters. I've got 6 people on the ground. We are not getting 40 people out of there one at a time in 9 minutes. Sura, listening from the bridge, felt something she recognized distantly from 11 years of reading incident reports written by people who had lived through exactly this kind of arithmetic and never fully recovered from having had to do it. The cold, specific horror of watching a rescue become a triage. Director Solis, Marsh said, opening the colony channel directly. I need every non-essential resource you have converging on the southeast quadrant boundary right now. Vehicles, equipment, anything that can physically move people fast. My team can't outcarry this on foot. Already moving, Solis said, her voice raw but steady. I believe you now, Commander. God help me, I believe you completely. Tell me what to do. Get your people to the boundary line and pull. Don't cross it yourselves unless my Marines are with you. We don't know yet if civilian contact triggers the same partial process effect Kane just walked through. Kane, coordinate with the colony's response teams. Use them as extraction runners. Keep your Marines on anchor and first contact. Copy, Commander. The next 7 minutes were, in Sura's later formal account to the review board, the closest she had ever come to understanding, in a fully embodied and non-theoretical way, why the Virith built an entire civilization's worth of philosophy around the sanctity of memory. She watched, on the bridge's main display, a coordinated evacuation unfold across a silence zone that no sound crossed, that colonists inside walked through without any awareness that time was running out around them, that Marines and civilian volunteers alike crossed and recrossed with the specific, disciplined urgency of people who understood, on some level below language, that every person they failed to reach in the next few minutes would not simply die. They would never have existed at all. Kane's team pulled 11 more colonists across the boundary in the first 4 minutes. Bakri's second heartbeat had been the only one anyone found. The rest came out disoriented, frightened, but singular, unlayered, themselves. Solis's civilian volunteers, moving in fast relay teams with equipment carts, pulled another 9. 6 minutes, Okafor said. Commander, boundary's not just expanding anymore. It's contracting inward on itself in places, like it's consolidating. I think it's preparing for something. I don't have a model for what. Kane status. 20 extracted, Commander. I count roughly 20 still inside, mostly clustered near the processing core. That's the deepest point. That's where Bakri was. That's where the crystal deposit is, Sura said suddenly, looking at the colony schematic. The hollow crystal, the mineral this entire colony exists to extract. Commander, if this entity's presence correlates with that mineral the way the Marlowe's Reach incident correlated with whatever Calder's Rest was extracting. The crystal's the anchor point, Marsh said, already moving. Kane, can you reach the processing core? Negative, Commander, not in the time we've got left. It's too deep, and whatever's happening to the boundary right now, it's getting harder to move through the closer we get to center. Marsh was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then we don't extract the last 20, she said. We stop the collapse before it reaches them. Commander, how? Okafor asked. You said this thing correlates with the crystal. Marlowe's Reach's data. Do we have a resonance profile on the mineral itself? We have partial spectral data from the original survey, yes, but Commander, we never got close enough to the Calder's Rest deposit to run active analysis. It collapsed before. Then we're about to get the first live data anyone's ever collected. Marsh turned to the tactical display. Chong, I need the ledger's main array reconfigured for a resonance pulse, tuned to the mineral spectral signature, targeted at the processing core. If this thing's using that crystal as an anchor point the way Okafor's anchor cores use shielded storage, I want to know if we can disrupt that anchor from orbit before it finishes whatever it's doing to those 20 people. Commander, we've never tested anything like that. I don't have a model for what a resonance strike on an active retrocausal anchor point does. Could disrupt it. Could also accelerate it. I know, Marsh said. Do it anyway. We have 5 minutes and no better option, and I am not going to sit in orbit and watch 20 people disappear because we were too careful to try. 9. The pulse the Undying Ledger's main array took 90 seconds to reconfigure. 90 seconds that Sura Embeth spent watching Elena Marsh stand utterly still at the center of her bridge, hands folded, jaw tight, doing the specific and terrible work of holding a decision steady once it had already been made, because there was no longer any use for doubt now that action was underway. Array ready, Chong reported. Commander, I want it on record that I flagged this as untested. Noted and logged. Chong, fire when ready. The pulse, when it went out, registered on the Undying Ledger sensors not as a beam or a blast but as something stranger. A wave of directed resonant energy that seemed, watching its progression on the display, to bend slightly as it approached the surface, as though the space around Persephone Deep's southeast quadrant had already begun, in some small way, to disagree with the straightforward geometry the rest of the universe still obeyed. It struck the processing core. For a long, terrible 3 seconds, nothing on the sensor readout changed at all. Then Okafor's voice, cracking with something that was not quite relief yet, because relief required more certainty than she had. Commander, boundaries destabilizing. Not collapsing, destabilizing. The contractions stopped. I'm reading, Commander. I'm reading sound. Sounds coming back inside the zone. Kane's voice cut in, breathless, from the ground. Commander, confirmed. I've got audio inside the boundary. I can hear them. I can hear the colonists talking. It's Commander, it's receding. The whole zone's receding fast. Casualties? Marsh asked, and Sura heard, underneath the discipline of the question, the specific fear of a woman who had asked this exact question 9 months earlier and heard an answer she had spent every day since trying to make sure she never heard again. A long pause while Kane's team swept the retreating boundary. Commander, Kane said finally, and his voice had something in it that Sura had not heard from him at any point in the last harrowing 20 minutes. Full head count at the processing core. 23. 23, Marsh repeated. We extracted 20. That's 3 more than... Yes, Commander. Kane's voice was rough. I'm reading 3 additional biometric signatures that don't match anyone on the current active roster. Commander, I think the resonance pulse didn't just stop the collapse. I think it reversed part of it. I've got Riel, Okonkwo and Chun standing in the middle of the processing floor right now, confused, disoriented, and very much alive. The bridge was silent for a long moment. The 3 from the original 9th report, Sura said slowly, feeling something in her chest she had no immediate professional language for. The ones Director Solis could not remember. Get Solis on the line, Marsh said, and for the first time since Sura had boarded the Undying Ledger, her voice was not entirely steady. Tell her 3 of her people are standing in the processing hall right now, and tell her—" She paused, and something crossed her face that Sura would think about for a long time afterward. "Tell her to go remember them. X. What came back, and what didn't the final head count, completed 4 hours later once the Undying Ledger's medical team and Persephone Deep's own staff had finished a full colony-wide biometric sweep, stood at 306. Every name on Sura Embeth's original independently verified manifest was accounted for. Nobody had been permanently lost. The resonance pulse, whatever it had actually done to the entity itself, Okafor's post-incident analysis, still preliminary weeks later, suggested it had disrupted the anchor point's connection to the crystal deposit rather than destroying the entity outright, meaning the undertow, or whatever it truly was, had likely simply withdrawn, rather than been destroyed, into whatever deeper geological structure it had originally emerged from, had, this once, given every unmade name back. It had not been like that at Calder's Rest. 16 names there remained unrecovered, and would, everyone aboard the Undying Ledger understood without needing to say it aloud, likely remain that way permanently. Marsh had built this entire ship, this entire mission, around the terrible arithmetic of that loss, and Persephone Deep's full recovery did not undo it. It simply meant, this time, the arithmetic had come out differently, and every person aboard who had lived through Calder's Rest understood exactly how much that difference had cost in preparation, obsession, and the specific refusal to let the same failure happen twice. Sura found Elena Marsh hours later, standing alone in the Undying Ledger's server deck, one hand resting lightly against the housing of the nearest anchor core, in the specific posture of a person checking that something they had built with their whole heart had, this time, actually worked. "Commander. Liaison." Marsh didn't turn immediately. 306. Full recovery. "I keep checking the number because I don't quite believe it yet." "You built this," Sura said, gesturing to the humming racks around them. 9 months of grief, converted into 9 independently shielded storage cores and a resonance array nobody had ever tested until 4 hours ago. "I would like to understand something, Commander, if you're willing to tell me." "Go ahead. When you built this ship, when you named it what you named it, did you believe you would ever get a result like today's? Or did you build it already expecting, again, to lose people and simply refusing to let them be forgotten regardless?" Marsh was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting against the anchor core's housing. "Both," she said finally. "I built it hoping for today. I built it expecting Calder's Rest again, because hope's not a plan, and I've learned that the expensive way. Every system on this ship exists because I assumed, going in, that we might not save everyone, and I was not going to let might not save everyone mean might lose them completely. Today we got lucky and we got prepared, and both of those things mattered. I don't know which one mattered more. I don't think it's a question with an answer that helps anybody." She finally turned to look at Sura directly. "What I know is that 306 names are going to walk off this planet with their own memories fully intact, and 16 more are finally, permanently, on public record instead of buried in a classified file nobody outside a small grieving unit was ever going to read. That's not nothing, Liaison. Some days, out here, that's the whole job." Sura Embeth, Virith archivist, who had built her own 11-year career on the conviction that a name remembered was a small resurrection, found she had nothing more diplomatic or more precise to add to that. She simply stood beside Elena Marsh, in the humming quiet of a server deck built entirely around a species' refusal to let anyone be forgotten, and let the silence be, for once, an entirely ordinary and welcome kind. 11. The ones who came back the medical bay aboard the Undying Ledger had never been designed to hold this many people at once, and for the first 6 hours after the extraction it didn't try to. Persephone Deep's own clinic, larger and better equipped for a colony of 300, absorbed most of the 20 extracted colonists, while the Undying Ledger's smaller facility took the 6 who needed closer observation. The 5 with no lingering biometric anomalies, kept overnight purely as a precaution, and Bakri, whose second heartbeat had vanished the moment Kane pulled him across the boundary, but whose readings, Dr. Anwin Ose Marsh, the ship's chief medical officer, no relation to. The captain, despite the coincidence of surname that had produced a running joke aboard for the better part of a year, refused to fully clear until she understood what, exactly, had been happening to him. "I don't have a clean answer for you," Ose Marsh told Marsh and Sura, 3 hours after the extraction, standing over a diagnostic display that showed Bakri's vitals settling into an entirely ordinary, singular, human pattern. His biometrics are normal. Every marker I can test for says he's completely himself. But I've run a full neurological scan twice now, and I don't have a better word for it than a residue. A pattern in his neural activity that doesn't match baseline human cognition exactly, doesn't match anything hostile either. It's faint. It might fade entirely with time. It might not. I genuinely don't know, Commander, and I want that uncertainty on the record rather than pretending I've got a tidier answer than I do. Is he in danger? Marsh asked. Not that I can currently detect, but I'd like him monitored for the next several months, ideally by someone who has some baseline understanding of what he went through, because I suspect the honest answer to what he needs isn't primarily medical. Osei Marsh glanced toward the private recovery room where Bakri sat, awake, quiet, staring at his own hands with the specific unfocused attention of someone doing an inventory of themselves. I think what he needs is someone he trusts to keep telling him, patiently, for as long as it takes, exactly who he is. I think that matters more right now than anything I can put in 4 lines. Sura found herself, without quite deciding to, offering. I would be willing to sit with him, if he would find that helpful. Marsh looked at her for a moment, something considering and quietly approving crossing her face. You don't have to, liaison. That's not part of your posting. I am aware, Sura said. I would like to anyway. Bakri did not speak for the first 20 minutes Sura sat with him. He simply looked at his hands, occasionally flexing his fingers as though testing that they still obeyed him, and Sura, drawing on 11 years of archival training that had taught her the specific patience required to sit with grief that was not yet ready to become language, said nothing either and simply stayed. I remember being there, he said finally, without looking up. I remember doing my shift. I remember the console readings. And then there's a gap. Not blank. Not nothing. It's more like, do you know what it's like to remember a room you've been in, but not remember which specific things in it are actually yours, and which things you've just been told belong to somebody else until you can't quite tell the difference anymore? I do not know that specifically, Sura said honestly, but I would like to understand it, if you're willing to try to explain it to me. That's what it was like, being in there. Bakri's hands stilled. It wasn't cruel. That's the thing nobody seems to want to hear when I try to describe it. It wasn't angry, or hungry the way a predator's hungry. It was patient, curious almost, like it had never actually met something that thought about itself the way I think about myself, and it wanted to understand what that was, and understanding it, for whatever it is, meant sort of trying it on, wearing it for a while, seeing how it fit. And the second voice, the one the sergeant's scanner picked up. I think that was it, learning to talk the way I talk, practicing. Bakri finally looked up at her, and something in his eyes, Sura thought, held both the specific fear of a young man who had nearly ceased to exist and something else beneath it. A strange, careful curiosity that unsettled her more than fear would have, because it was not quite the reaction she had expected. Do you think it's still out there? Wherever it went. Commander Marsh believes it withdrew rather than was destroyed. Yes. I think I believe that too, Bakri said quietly. I think this is going to sound strange, liaison, and I don't fully understand it myself, but there's a part of me that doesn't feel like it entirely left. Not like something still in my head, nothing like that. Dr. Osei Marsh's tests would have found that. It's more like, you know how you can spend enough time in a language that isn't your first one that you start to think in fragments of it, even after you stop actively using it? Yes, Sura said. I have experienced exactly that learning coalition standard. It's like that. I think whatever that thing is, it left a little bit of its shape, I suppose, in how I think now. Not dangerous. Not even necessarily bad. Just different. New. He was quiet for a moment. Is that supposed to frighten me? Sura considered the question with the full seriousness it deserved. I do not know, she said. I would suggest that it need not, provided it does not change who you choose to be going forward, in ways you yourself would not endorse. A person is not only the sum of what has touched them. A person is also, and I would argue primarily, the sum of what they do next with full knowledge of everything that has touched them. She paused. You are still deciding what you do next, Bakri. That decision remains entirely yours. Whatever residue that entity left behind does not, As far as anyone currently understands, take that from you. Bakri was quiet for a long moment, and then, for the first time since the extraction, something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Small, tired, but genuine. That's a very archivist thing to say, he said. I mean that as a compliment. I intended it as one, Sura said, and found, to her mild surprise, that she meant it entirely. The 5 other extracted colonists recovered without complication over the following days, their accounts of their time inside the boundary largely consistent with one another. A stretch of ordinary, unremarkable work, and then, abruptly, the disorienting shock of Kane's hand on their shoulder and the sudden return of sound. None of them reported the layered, doubled experience Bakri described. Dr. Ose Marsh's working theory, offered cautiously and without full confidence, was that proximity to the crystal deposit's core determined not merely how quickly the erasure process advanced, but how deeply it engaged with a person's cognition before it could be interrupted. Meaning Bakri, standing nearest the processing core when Kane reached him, had simply been furthest along in a process the others had been extracted well before reaching. Which raises an uncomfortable question, Okafor said, during a full crew debrief 4 days after the incident. About the 16 we lost at Calder's Rest, and about Denny specifically. If proximity and time determine how much of a person the process actually reaches before extraction, Commander, I don't want to say this if it's not useful, but I think it might be. What if there's a threshold? What if Denny wasn't erased completely? What if he's just further along the same scale Bakri's on, and we don't currently have any way to reverse that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's permanent the way we've been treating it as permanent. The debrief room went very quiet. That's not confirmed, Marsh said carefully, and Sura, watching her, understood the specific effort it took the captain to keep hope contained rather than let it run ahead of the evidence. That's a hypothesis based on one data point, from an incident with a different mineral, different conditions, different resonance profile. I am not going to promise Denny's family something I can't currently deliver. I know, Commander, Okafor said. I'm not saying promise it. I'm saying I'd like permission to keep researching it. Properly. With the new data we've got from Cassandra. If there's even a chance the resonance technique that brought back 3 names on Cassandra could be refined enough to try, carefully, cautiously, on someone who's already been in the state Denny's in for 9 months. Marsh was quiet for a long moment, and Sura saw, in that silence, the specific weight of a woman who had built an entire ship out of the refusal to accept a loss as final, being offered, for the first time in 9 months, the possibility that the loss she carried most personally might not be as final as she had trained herself to believe. You have permission, Marsh said finally, her voice tight but steady. Careful, documented, fully transparent research. No promises to Denny's family until we have something real to promise. But yes, Chief, keep researching it. Please. Copy that, Commander, Okafor said quietly. I will. Sura, watching this exchange, thought of her own 11-year conviction that a person died twice. Once physically, once when the last record of them was lost, and understood, for the first time, a third possibility she had never previously had cause to consider. That somewhere between those 2 deaths, there might exist a third state entirely, neither fully present nor fully gone, and that a species built by a hostile world to refuse losing anyone completely might, given enough time and enough stubbornness, find a way to reach even there. She did not know, yet, whether Denny Achebe would ever come home the way his sergeant hoped. She knew only that the crew of the Undying Ledger had decided, collectively and without needing to vote on it, that they were not yet willing to close that particular file. 12. The review and the names that stayed. The review convened at Concord Station Haveth 22 days later, in the same cold, deliberately neutral chamber that had, Sura noted with a distant sense of professional déjà vu she chose not to examine too closely, hosted the Marlowe's Reach incident review 9 months earlier under an entirely different panel. The charges were, in their broad shape, familiar to anyone who had studied Concord military liaison history. The Undying Ledger had entered Cassandra's system and initiated ground operations without full Concord authorization, had fired an untested resonance weapon at an active geological feature within a populated colony's territory without formal environmental clearance, had directed civilian colony personnel into active combat-adjacent operations without their informed consent to the specific risk involved. Marsh answered each charge with the same flat, unornamented directness Sura had come to expect from her. We entered the system because a verified, independently cross-referenced manifest showed 3 colonists had already been erased from every record on site, and Concord threat classification review timelines run in weeks, not minutes. We fired the resonance pulse because 20 people were disappearing inside a collapsing boundary, and our best available data suggested it might stop the process. It was the only option available in the time remaining that wasn't simply watching. We used civilian personnel as extraction support because my Marines could not physically reach 40 people alone in 9 minutes, and Director Solis and her people volunteered in full awareness of the risk the moment they understood what was at stake. "Did you consider?" the panel chair asked. A Virith official Sura did not recognize personally, though she noted, with a small private satisfaction, that the panel had specifically requested a Virith representative for this particular review. That firing an untested weapon at an unknown geological anomaly might have accelerated the very collapse you were attempting to prevent? I considered it for approximately 4 seconds, which was the length of time I had to consider it, Marsh said. I decided that a real chance of stopping the collapse was worth more than a certain chance of doing nothing while it finished on its own. I would make that decision again under the same time constraints, and I want the board to understand that I am not saying that lightly. I have lost people to exactly this kind of choice before. I know precisely what it costs when it goes wrong. I made the best informed decision available in the time I had, and this time it worked. I don't have the luxury of knowing in advance which times it will. A second panel member, a Pharaonic Logistics Commissioner named Orel Vasht, whose formal manner Sura recognized as belonging to the specific school of Concord officer, who believed procedure was itself a form of protection rather than an obstacle to it, leaned forward. "Commander Marsh, I want to press on something specific. You directed civilian colonists into extraction roles inside an active, expanding, lethal anomaly. Convoy Commander Varesh's own report, submitted to this board, states that his medical personnel were prepared to render assistance and were held at range by your order. Why not use trained coalition or Concord personnel exclusively, rather than civilians with no combat or emergency response training? Because I had 6 Marines on the ground and 40 people left inside a boundary that was going to finish collapsing in under 9 minutes, Marsh said. 6 trained extractors cannot physically reach 40 people in 9 minutes, Commissioner, regardless of how well-trained they are. Director Solis's volunteers were not untrained bystanders I conscripted. They were colony personnel who understood their own facility's layout better than my Marines did, who could move faster through terrain they knew, and who made an informed choice in real time with full knowledge of the risk, because the alternative was watching their neighbors disappear while waiting for a rescue that couldn't move fast enough on its own. And if one of those civilian volunteers had been lost in the process, had crossed the boundary and not come back? Marsh was quiet for exactly 1 second, the same pause Sura had, by now, come to recognize as the specific length of time Elena Marsh required to hold a difficult truth steady before speaking it aloud. Then I would have carried that, Commissioner, the same way I carry 16 names from Calder's Rest, she said. I do not offer that lightly, and I am not offering it now as a rhetorical flourish. I am telling this board plainly, every decision I made on Cassandra was made against the certainty of losing people if I did nothing, weighed against the risk of losing different people or the same people by acting. There was no option on the table that carried 0 risk. There has not been an option like that available to me since the day I took this commission. I chose the option that gave the most people the best realistic chance with the information I had, in the time I had it. I will make that same trade again because the alternative, waiting for a version of certainty this kind of threat does not permit, has already cost 16 people who are not coming back. Vasht did not respond immediately, and Sura noted, watching him, that whatever objection he had prepared to raise next, he set it aside, at least for the moment. Sergeant Idris Kane testified after Marsh called specifically. Sura understood, because the panel wished to hear directly from the individual who had physically crossed the boundary and made contact with Bakri, the clearest available witness to what the anomaly actually did to a person mid-process. Sergeant, describe, as precisely as you're able, what you observed and experienced during your extraction of the colonist-designated Bakri. Kane answered in the same flat, controlled register he had used describing Calder's Rest to Sura days earlier. Not detached, Sura understood by now, but disciplined, a man who had learned exactly how much feeling he could afford to let into his voice before it stopped him from finishing the account at all. I made physical contact and experienced what I can only describe as a kind of pull. Cold, spreading, not painful in a way I can point to a specific location for. My own biometric monitor registered a brief, anomalous secondary signature during the contact, consistent with what we later confirmed on the colonist's own readings before extraction. I extracted him within approximately 4 seconds of contact. Post-extraction, his readings normalized to baseline human. Mine did as well immediately. You have experienced a similar boundary crossing previously, Sergeant, during the Calder's Rest incident 9 months ago. I have. How did the two experiences compare? Kane was quiet for a moment. Calder's Rest, we didn't have the anchor protocol yet. We didn't have a resonance model. We didn't have anything but raw extraction and hope. Cassandra, we had both, and we had 9 months of preparation behind every decision made in the field. I want the board to understand that the difference in outcome wasn't luck, Commissioner. It was 9 months of very deliberate, very expensive work, done specifically so that the next time this happened, it wouldn't go the way it went the first time. I lost people at Calder's Rest I am never getting back. I did not lose anyone at Cassandra. That difference has a name, and its name is preparation, not chance. The chair made a note. Thank you, Sergeant. You may step down. Director Amara Solis testified next, in person, and her account of Priya Chun, Tomas Riel, and Davi Okonkwolan's recovery. 3 names she now remembered with the specific, aching clarity of someone who understood exactly how close she had come to permanently forgetting they had ever existed. Left, by Sura's careful observation, a noticeable and lasting impression on every member of the panel, regardless of species. I would like the board to understand, Solis said, near the end of her testimony, that if the Undying Ledger had waited for a formal Concord threat classification before acting, I would currently be filing a routine quarterly report listing 300 colonists, and I would have no memory at all that the number used to be different. I would not know I had lost anyone. I would not know there was anyone to grieve. The coalition vessel violated protocol. I am, and my entire colony is, alive and whole and remembered because it did. Sura testified last, and unlike her previous appearances before Concord review panels, found she had, for the first time in 11 years, very little professional distance left to maintain. I have spent my career, she told the panel, believing that the greatest service my archive could offer the Concord was diligence, thorough, patient, unhurried record-keeping, built to outlast any single crisis. I still believe records matter enormously. What Cassandra taught me is that diligence without speed is, in certain specific and increasingly common circumstances, simply a more thorough way of arriving too late. The coalition vessel that answered this distress call did not replace the value of careful record-keeping. It demonstrated what happens when careful record-keeping is paired with the willingness to act, immediately and without waiting for permission, on what those records reveal. I would ask the board to consider formally whether Concord Protocol as currently written is capable of producing that pairing on its own, or whether it requires partners who are prepared to move faster than our own procedures allow. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. Sura learned afterward, from a clerk sympathetic to her professional curiosity, that Commissioner Vasht had argued forcefully during deliberation for a harsher finding. Full operational suspension pending a lengthier independent inquiry, on the grounds that a precedent permitting captains to override Concord authorization whenever their own risk calculus disagreed with it would, over time, erode the very framework of coordinated response the Concord had spent centuries building. It was, Sura thought when she heard it, not an unreasonable position, even if she did not, herself, agree with where it landed. Vasht was not wrong that a galaxy of individually judging captains, each convinced of their own righteousness, was its own kind of danger. He was simply, she suspected, describing a danger that belonged to a more comfortable galaxy than the one they currently lived in. The finding, when it came, held the shape Sura had, by now, begun to recognize as an emerging pattern in her own professional life. Formal censure entered on permanent record, review scheduled in 2 years. Appended, this time without the visible reluctance she suspected the previous panel's finding had carried, with a formal recommendation that the Concord establish, in partnership with the Coalition of Earth and Allied Worlds, a jointly staffed rapid threat response initiative explicitly modeled on the Undying Ledger's Anchor and Response Protocol, with expedited authorization procedures for situations involving verified active erasure, absorption, or unclassified retrocausal threats. The recommendation passed the panel 3 votes to 1. Commissioner Vash's dissent was entered into the record in full at his own insistence, and Sura, reading it later carefully the way she read everything, found she respected him rather more for insisting on it than she would have if he had simply let the majority findings stand unchallenged. Marsh received the censure with the same contained stillness she had shown throughout. She received the recommendation with something that, for just a moment, allowed itself to look like relief. 13. What the archive remembers 3 weeks after the review concluded, Sura Embeth stood once more in the Undying Ledger's server deck, this time by invitation rather than professional necessity, watching Chief Okafor run a routine diagnostic across all 9 anchor cores while, on a secondary display nearby, a live feed showed Persephone Deep's newly expanded population, 306 names, plus, as of 6 days ago, 1 newly registered birth, the first child born on the colony. Since the incident, whose parents had asked, with quiet and deliberate intention, that Sura's archive personally hold a redundant off-world copy of the child's birth record from the very first day of its existence. "You're staying aboard, then?" Okafor said, not quite a question. "Marsh mentioned you put in for permanent liaison assignment. I have spent 11 years believing my most important work happened in an archive, reviewing records other people had already survived to write," Sura said. "I have learned, this month, that I would rather be present for the writing of them. I intend to remain, if the Coalition and the Concord can agree on the appropriate formal designation for whatever it is I am now doing." "Cold Iron's not picky about titles," Okafor said, with the specific dry humor Sura was beginning to understand was this crew's particular way of holding difficult things lightly enough to keep carrying them. "We mostly just care whether you show up when it matters and stay sharp enough to catch the thing everyone else missed. You did that twice now, from what I hear. Once with the Cadence flag on Corvain, I read the file, Small Universe, and once with 3 names in a quarterly report nobody else would have double-checked." Sura considered this, watching the anchor cores hum their patient, redundant, stubborn refusal to let anything they held be forgotten. "There is a teaching among my people," she said. "A person dies twice. Once when the body stops, and once, finally, when the last record of them is lost. I have spent my career trying to delay the second death as long as possible. I believe I have found, aboard this vessel, colleagues who share that conviction so completely that they built an entire warship around it. Not merely to remember the lost Chief Okafor, but to refuse, as a matter of active and ongoing practice, to let the losing happen in the first place, wherever it can possibly be prevented." Okafor was quiet for a moment, her hand resting against the nearest core housing in the same unconscious, checking gesture Sura had seen Marsh make weeks earlier. 306, she said finally. "Every single one. Still here, still themselves, still remembered by everyone who ever loved them. That's the whole job, liaison. Some days it costs us. Most days, if we do it right, it doesn't have to." Outside the viewport, Cassandra turned slowly in its star's light. Its colony rebuilding, its rosters accurate, its dead, for once, this time blessedly, outnumbered by its living. The Undying Ledger held orbit a while longer, running its patient sweeps, watching for any sign the undertow might return, before finally turning outward, toward whatever came next, carrying with it 9 shielded cores full of names that intended, with the full stubborn weight of a species built by a hostile world to refuse quiet extinction, to go on being remembered for a very long time.